Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. The Ukraine War news update. The first part thereof for today that was pre-recorded. I recorded it and apparently I was looking at the wrong browser. I don't know. I recorded the whole video with the Guardian page up and it was part of another video I had lined up, and I am just gutted because my mates just called me and said, I'm 45 minutes away, I'm going to come in and see you. I'm like, oh, I'm just about to do a live stream and I've got all these everything's happening. Anyway, I'm so sorry that I had previously cocked up my hits and losses video. So the easiest way for me to do this, but I might have to rush through this, so sorry if I go hell for leather, is by doing a live here and getting it done in that way. So I am very sorry for that situation. But hopefully it gives you guys a chance to hang out together, get your conversations in, and see if I'm talking nonsense or not. So I'm going to place myself over there. I will try and keep an eye on the live stream chat and see what we have to discuss in terms of where is it? Here you are. In terms of the stats, so we're going to start with the Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, of course. All usual caveat supply, and you can find them in the description to the video below. 1,510 personnel lost is somewhat lower than we've seen in terms of the highest of 2,000 odd over the last week, but actually has crept back up from the New Year's Eve, I think, scenario where we saw a drop over the first and second of the year. So up to 1,510 personnel lost. 2 tanks, a very low number there. 23 troop carrying AFVs is pretty significant. That's above average, as are the artillery systems. Interestingly, we do have 1 helicopter here today. We heard that the 4 helicopters have possibly gone down, maybe 4 and 1 damaged, maybe 1 that went down was a damaged one. We saw 1 get taken down by an unmanned sea vehicle, and that was added because there's visual confirmation of this. So the question here is, do they add solely on visual confirmation, or are there other pieces of data that can be sort of irrefutable to the point where they will add it to the list? We heard that 1 was shot down by that USV, the unmanned sea vehicle, the surface vehicle that was firing R-73 missiles, air-to-air missiles, at the helicopter. Then you had 1 that was damaged and took a bad landing, crashed, and apparently the crew died on that one. Then we heard that there's possibly a 3rd one in that incident that was damaged. Then we heard that another helicopter was shot down by Russian air defense itself, and then possibly another helicopter was lost, but I don't know if that other one was that one that had the damages. So essentially, we have claims of around 4 helicopters lost. Now, 2 of them have been added to the list. So that's really good news for the Ukrainians there. 73 vehicles and fuel tanks is also excellent for the Ukrainians. Now, there were a couple of loss lists from Andrew Perpetua. First one from the 2nd, a good haul, and that sounds horrible. These are human beings. But in terms of statistics, the higher the number that Andrew Perpetua sees that are lost in a single day, that shows, it's a kind of trend lines like we see with the claims here. It gives us an indication of what's going on. So on the 2nd, some pretty heavy losses. But we must remember that the videos being produced to social media to represent these losses, where we try and cross-reference them against the losses that the general staff say, aren't always from the day before. The general staff figures are usually from the day before or very recent to these claims, right? They amassed those claims from all these different units that supply evidence for them to some kind of central area, and the claims go up on that infographic here. We have social media. Different units can publish to social media, and sometimes it can be like 6 months down the line, 2 months down the line, 1 month, 3 weeks, whatever. It doesn't mean that those 204 people that you see pass away in those videos, or that Andrew Perpetua and his team sees, refers to the previous 24 hours. So, all those kind of caveats and whatnot. Now, another very heavy day for the Russians, sorry, in terms of their losses. Here we have about maybe 8-to-1, 7-6-to-1, maybe 6-to-1 ratio, something like that. Really heavy ratio there, but a lot of that happening in the civilian vehicle and an ATV vehicle categories. We are going to see, in fact, I'll probably show you this to show this to you now because it's kind of relevant for what I'm talking about. If I can find the right, oh my goodness, it's all the way back here. Okay, so what we have here is video of 7 quads attacking Ukrainian positions. So the 12th Azov Brigade halted the assault near the trenches, destroying the enemy's light vehicles and inflicting numerous casualties, killed and wounded. We have a video of these quads attacking, and again, the questions are as to whether this is an example of suboptimal equipment being used, as in they would use APCs if they could, but that like I've said many times before, there are advantages. Do these vehicles set off mines? Are these vehicles more maneuverable? Is it better to have 20 people on 20 vehicles rather than 20 people on one vehicle, which means that it only takes one hit and then they're all dead type thing? Having more vehicles with fewer people on means that the enemy, in this case the Ukrainians, have to try and hit all of those vehicles with far more munitions, etc., etc. So really, there are some advantages to using vehicles like this, but also some disadvantages. They aren't armored, and it's going to be potentially less efficient getting people from A to B. Now, here we have a motorbike traveling across a field, and it triggers a mine and blows up. So cannot park there, mates, says no reports. Annihilation of a Russian motorcyclist after hitting an anti-tank mine in the Pokrovsk direction. So that shows that motorcycles can trigger mines. Now, is that a pressure mine? Don't know. What's triggering it? Is it metal? A magnet mine? Is it some other triggering of this explosion? I don't know, but certainly answers the question, can motorcycles trigger mines? The answer is, well, in this case, yes. So then when we go back to lists like this, we know that ATVs and civilian vehicles are being used in attacks or being used to get troops from A to B to the contact line in a way that you would normally have expected APCs to be used. So again, it's all these pieces. Sometimes I'm repeating myself. I have 50% newbies watching these videos. So, I've got to make sure that, repetition is half of teaching. It used to be this thing that 80% of children forget 80% of what they're taught within 24 hours of being taught it, which is why you have to repeat yourself all the time. That's an element of teaching. So we forget stuff. So there you go. Anyway, looking at the losses, a lot more Russian losses than Ukrainian losses. We're going to look at the Ukrainian losses first. We have a boat, a Bogdana self-propelled gun that's made by the Ukrainians. That's been destroyed by Lancet. Got Lancets taking out T-80 tank and 2 other nondescript tanks there. So Lancet's still an issue, but not too many pieces of kit here destroyed or damaged. And then we go to look at the Russians, and we have an engineering vehicle, some boats, quite a lot of boats. So I presume a montage of boats was submitted to the socials. Night vision FPV drones taking the majority of them out. Single artillery piece, a few tanks thrown in, half dozen infantry fighting vehicles, some APCs, infantry mobility vehicle, Ural trucks, a lot of quads there. 6 quads, 3 of those destroyed, 3 damaged, and then a lot of loafs and motorcycles and SUVs and whatnot. So an awful lot of Russian equipment, not all of it, your high-end military equipment, but a lot of equipment being lost by the Russians. Then we go on to the third. And here we have closer to parity, probably 1.5 to 1, but combat assets, the Russians losing maybe 2.5, maybe 3 to 1, what the Ukrainians losing. So that is an interesting aspect of these stats. The Ukrainians getting another Bogdana damaged. We have a couple of tanks, a couple of infantry fighting vehicles, a couple of APCs, one from the UK there, FV-103, but nothing too crazy. Some MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles from Ukrainian manufactured or Western provided. A lot of civilian or some civilian vehicles, I guess, but fairly similar to the Russian losses in civilian vehicles. The Russians losing, importantly, an air defense system here, Strela 10, short-range air defense system being destroyed. A recovery vehicle, some older howitzers, D-20s and 30s. We have a single tank there, and then about a dozen infantry fighting vehicles, most of those destroyed. And then 100% of the AFVs and APCs destroyed, about a dozen, maybe 10, MTLBs, those older Russian ones there. Interesting that an AFV here destroyed is a T-62 without a turret. So they're using a tank without a turret to do the job of, I don't know what, but anyway, that was taken out. Again, we get this picture that the Russians are operating at a suboptimal level and using a lot of civilian vehicles and ATVs to do their job. Okay, then we have Andrew, who's just done, who supplies those lists. The fuses have standard deviations on their activation pressure. So I guess you can set it to blow up what you want. I mean, the end result is, and this is something I've been talking about for an awful long time, that the Russians are being forced to use equipment in ways that they aren't designed to be used, ways that are suboptimal, I think, for them. You know, in a perfect world, they'd be using the most perfect military vehicles to do any given job, and instead they're driving around on Mad Max vehicles, motorcycles, quads, etc., etc. Now, some of these are going to have advantages to being used, but generally speaking, the Russians are running out of some of their deeper stockpiles, and they're making do with all sorts of different scenarios. Andrew Perpetua says, early in the war, there was a Ukrainian sapper who was saying people cannot trigger an anti-tank mine, and then I shouldn't laugh. And then he stepped on one and it exploded. Oh, sorry, that's a Ukrainian sapper. I definitely shouldn't laugh. Yeah, so that is an example that mines can be used for a whole different variety of in a variety of different ways. Okay, so Andrew's qualifying my claim there. No, you don't set it to what you want. They're just made with an inherent variation in activation pressure. It doesn't set off at X kilograms. It is Y% at X kilograms, Z% at X plus 1 kilograms. Okay, yeah, so there you go. Goose Springsteen says, is there a tension between your morality and geopolitics? Russia gains influence by enabling autocracy in Africa. France is in retreat partially because of higher morals. Do we need to play dirty? Oh, that's a big question. Going to deal with that one later, mate. Okay, thanks, Goose, by the way. Just continue here. We'll do some questions at the end. Ukraine will introduce a digital effectiveness rating for commanders. I wonder if Andrew knows about this. So the government has approved a decree, not knows about it, but has more information than I do, because I was wondering when I recorded this video earlier exactly what this meant. So the government has approved a decree where commanders will report enemy hits. And I presume that means Ukrainian hits on Russian forces via the Army Plus app. Reports will sync with the Delta combat system rather than hits on Ukrainians. Whether this is all part of getting accuracy in data, I guess first and foremost for them to be able to make better decisions, but then also to I guess communicate to the outside world in a way that's more trusted. We spend all our time trying to cross-reference claims from, say, the Ukrainian General Staff with Andrew and his team's lists, with all of these other data points to suggest that either the General Staff claims are somewhat correct or they're somewhat not correct. I am of the opinion that they are largely correct. I do not concentrate too much on the overall numbers, but on the trends that they are suggesting. So, we are seeing personnel losses creep back up. We are seeing troop carrying AFVs and artillery systems creep back up. I think that suggests that there's, the contact on the front line has increased since sort of New Year's Day and the 2nd, etc., etc. So it paints a picture of what's going on. Now we bring together all these different threads, and here's another one. The Kyiv Independent reporting that over 50,000 Russians seek missing in action through Ukraine's project. Representatives say, okay, what's going on here? So there's this project called I Want to Live, and it's a hotline that Russians can phone to find out about missing in action Russians. They phone it to Ukraine. What has happened here is that the Ukrainians are claiming that 48,000 or 50,000 inquiries, more than 50,000 inquiries, have been submitted by Russians seeking missing soldiers through Ukraine's I Want to Find project. So they talk in this article about this being a low number, considering that there are many people who aren't phoned up about by people who care enough to phone Ukraine to wonder where those missing people are. There might also be it could go the other way. So one caveat would be that there are multiple investigations per multiple inquiries per missing person. But the guy says here that actually it's going to be he said these numbers only reflect those unafraid to contact us, adding that their actual number of Russian soldiers missing in action can be much higher. So it could be that there are more than 50,000 soldiers missing, presumed dead, right? The Russians don't want to declare them as dead because then they have to pay out for them in compensation. What this means is that, you know, we look at the Mediazona, BBC Russia claims that around 90,000 people, and that's without the LPR and without the DPR and without the foreign mercenaries. This, you know, we are saying so 90,000 plus maybe 50,000 there. And we can start thinking that these Ukrainian general staff figures are at least somewhat correct. Like if you add on deserted, POWs, and wounded in action, then you're going to start getting to somewhere near 790,000. Okay, you could take 100,000 off, 690,000. My complete speculation would be you're probably going to have 400,000 people who are not going to fight again. So some of these wounded do get sent back into action. The Russians are pretty brutal with that. But there are a number of dead, deserted, POWs, and so badly wounded that you're not going to see them fight again. And it far, far exceeds what we saw in Afghanistan, where only merely sort of 10, 20,000 people in body bags and injured coming back from Afghanistan over a much longer period led those Russian families to protest against that, and you know it precipitated the end of the Afghanistan war. So you know it's a vastly different conflict this, where the thresholds for dissent appear to be an awful lot higher. Andrew Perpetua, going back to this, I presume, long story short, he says grading officers in this way to create a unified, predictable system is often used as a tool to increase trust in all sorts of industries. So this is a way of grading, I guess, commanders digitally as well. Okay, we hear that in one of the strikes on Lugov. So in the Kursk sector, where you've got Lugov and Rilsk above where the contact line is, you have these kind of staging areas in these larger towns, but you've also got strikes on Ivaniskoye, is it Markova as well, or it's not Martinivka. There's another strike. There's been about 4 strikes recently with HIMARS that have resulted in commanders dying, some really high value targets getting hit. We're hearing that one of the most wanted, someone on the most wanted list for Ukraine was killed 5 days ago in Lugov. Colonel Oleg Timoshin, who is the commander of the 52nd Long Range Aviation Regiment, wanted for ordering Russia's missile attack on Dnipro 2 years ago. That's the anti-ship missile that slammed into the building in Dnipro and killed 46 people. Terrible, terrible scenes from that. He was taken out just 5 days ago. So some of these strikes really do seem to be hitting their targets. And then we see this video. I'm just going to show you this because it's pretty amusing in a way, but the Ukrainians do this as well. This is a Russian tank with people on top, coke cage, operational tank, goes into a crater, and that's not going to do any good for the barrel there. That's probably going to be somewhat bent and a little bit screwed. This is amusing to see a Russian tank drive into a crater like that, with its people on top and its coke cage. It's going to be a bit of a job to get that back out. I mean, you can get it back out, but get an MTLB to tow that from the rear. But this happens quite a lot. I think Andrew might have shown this the other day. Was it M113s, Andrew, that were in a crater next to each other? This happens relatively frequently, and that's because visually it's very difficult to actually see, especially when you're, ideally you want a commander out the hatch. I mean, those soldiers should be doing a job, if they are indeed soldiers on the top, to kind of spot for I mean, he obviously knows it's there, but thinks he can get over it, and he can't. You do end up losing an awful lot of vehicles by driving them into craters, and it's really frustrating. They get stuck and then they get hit by FPV drones and whatnot. So Andrew then says, it's great having Andrew here, actually. The best part of this tank, we have like 30 videos of this happening from every single possible angle. And the fact that you're seeing this almost certainly means that there are Ukrainian, I presume this is a Ukrainian drone, means that this will be hit. And indeed, Ukraine hit this tank with drones after, which is exactly what you would expect. So this in other words, this driving precipitated the loss of that tank. Those are expensive mistakes to make. Both sides make them, and it's really frustrating. But it is explicable by point of fact that seeing out these things when you're driving is really, really difficult. Andrew says, I was thinking it looks a fairly decent tank. It's a brand new T80 BVM, he says. So that will hurt the Russians quite considerably. Right, moving on to distance strikes. And thanks, by the way, Andrew. Great to have you on board there. 81. So we're going back up to a lot of drones being fired on a nightly basis. A slew of 81 drones fired, all 100% of them taken down, 34 shot down, 47 falling. Well, I wouldn't say harmlessly to the earth. I think they fall and cause lots of debris problems. Indeed, Chernihiv and Sumy regions saw some of that. And Chernihiv was targeted yesterday with ballistic missiles. So ballistic missile hit the city, reporting on restrictions. Clearly visible is a big explosion. 2 private buildings were said to have been struck. Another clip of there showing the ballistic missile hitting. In fact, 1 person was killed, 4 injured in these 2 residential buildings. The question is with these, I'll be interested in what Andrew thinks about this. Again, so what options do you have? The Russians are indiscriminately bombing, indiscriminately sending ballistic missiles into residential areas. The Russians are targeting particular places, but they are inaccurate. The Russians are targeting particular places, but they're sent off kilter by electronic warfare or by air defenses. Those are your options. What is the most likely? I mean, there's probably examples of all of these. The Russians do seem to be indiscriminate, or at least have been. I wonder whether, as their missile stocks dwindle, whether they are trying to hit military targets more and more. So then the question is, sorry, there is another option that this is actually a military target, not a residential home, but you wouldn't know it was being used secretly or whatever. It's genuinely a target or very nearby to a target. So all of these different options are available here, and I guess you take your pick. There's probably a mix of all of those rationales being applied to Russian missile and drone strikes on Ukraine. Here is another picture of the damage done. Anton Gerashenko saying, ballistic missile strike destroying several residential buildings there. Massive drone attacks on Russia were reported last night. We've had several nights, a number of these nights, where Ukraine has done an awful lot of attacks on Russia, but then we don't really hear an awful lot about them. Some data emerges. Some data has emerged today. So here we have Moscow, Tula, Lipetsk, Tver, Novgorod, Smolensk, Leningrad regions being attacked by Ukrainian drones, and that has we have heard a varying amount of detail on each of these places. Let's start with ATACMS being reported by Russia on Belgorod, and in fact we have some video evidence of strikes, explosions near Belgorod, but don't know any details of that. So there could have been ATACMS there. Also Rostov, one not included on a previous list, we've got explosions there. That's down to the east of Ukraine's Donetsk border, down the south of Ukraine. We have Smolensk here being struck, possibly the Avangard plant, which is Russia's largest missile building holdings. The facility produces launch containers and solid fuel rocket engine casings. Here, Anton Gerashenko talks about that. Russian Telegram channels report a drone attack on Smolensk region of Russia last night. Reportedly, a missile engine plant was the target. Russian authorities say everything was shot down, but from different officials, they give different numbers of drones being used. Just to return, I did ask Andrew his opinion. He said, short story, there was one time Ukraine parked a train in a town to offload without a station. Russia hit the train with a missile. Ukraine showed damage to civilian houses. Sometimes this happens. Yeah, that is actually a really good point, which is, even if it's not, so sometimes they'll show, like this case, like exactly the wrong thing, and sometimes they'll cherry pick. So there might be like I guess, 10 strikes, and they'll show the one that hit the civilian building as well. So there is that. So that's another option, is you get psyops coming from the Ukrainian side as well. It becomes a PR exercise. But still, the question remains on what they strike, whether they. I would like to know whether the Russians are still ever indiscriminately targeting civilians. Do they just throw things into civilian areas irrespective? I think they'll do that with guided glide bombs to try and like reduce towns that are kind of half inhabited to rubble. That's probably more likely to happen in that situation. But I wonder with ballistic missiles and drones, because even the Russians, surely at this point of the war, aren't going to be ridiculous enough to say, I know what we'll do. We'll send this scarce resource a couple of 100 kilometers to slam into a civilian building when there could be other more militarily useful targets to hit. Leningrad region, which is, right up. So some of those regions that Max 24 earlier on listed here are really quite far north. You've got obviously Moscow, you've got Tula, Lipetsk, all getting further up. Leningrad, which is St. Petersburg area, is it not? So here we have an explosion at a gas processing plant there, and that explosion's fairly significant. Now, that could just be the drone exploding and it didn't hit anywhere in particular. We have Anton Gerashenko saying the largest seaport in Russia, Ust-Luga, was targeted by drones today in the Leningrad region. Russian Telegram channels report most of the drones attacking the Leningrad region today were allegedly shot down over the Novotrans terminal. So shot down over the target. How convenient. Located in the Ust-Luga seaport. It has been targeted before. Preliminary information indicates that windows in one of the port's buildings were damaged. Earlier, the governor reported that 4 drones had been drowned and stated that there were no casualties or significant damage. Ust-Luga is a major transportation hub for Russian oil trade. So that is Ust-Luga being hit. And here we have Ust-Luga. That is a picture of the port there. We have also Baltimore military airfield being attacked. When I pre-recorded this, I even gave you a bit of a rendition of Baltimore, which is what I always think when I see Baltimore airfield attacked by the Ukrainians. I just need to write a message to someone there. Right, done. Multitasking. Okay, so Baltimore military airfield was attacked by 5 drones on the night of January the 2nd. Today, the region was attacked by drones again. Local residents reported explosions. Andrew Perpetua just answering that it was a build-up to the Zaporizhia offensive. They were offloading stuff for that offensive. Was that in reply to what? Anyway, I shall move on. So Baltimore in Voronezh Malshevo, Baltimore military airfield, was attacked with at least 5 drones. All the drones were reportedly shot down, but we just don't know the proper BDA, proper battle damage assessment. As Tim White says, 2 other drone attacks by Ukraine have had some success. St. Petersburg, Astroprest reporting at least some damage to Ust-Luga port, where the Shadow fleet operates from, and then, as mentioned, Baltimore, unconfirmed but credible reports that the Baltimore airfield, home of the 47th Bomber Regiment, was targeted. So I guess we'll find out more information on that as time goes by. Now we're going to move to other bits and pieces. So a number of Ukrainians open to territorial concessions rises to 38%, a poll shows. So this is unsurprising. The longer you spend at war being attacked by the Russians in this case, the longer you are going to, the more likely you are going to be to allow for your land to be ceded to the attacker. It's just natural. It's like 3 years into the war, right? I'm fed up now. So here's my example, and I'm going to use Doris again. Although it's only moved marginally, well, it's not that marginal, it's moderate. So 32% of respondents were willing to compromise on territory for peace in October. Now that's 38%, so a 6% rise. Now, what I do want to say is, using good old Doris, imagine Doris is next door. So for me personally, I find that unacceptable, unconscionable that we would concede territory to Russia for attacking Ukraine, because that is to give permission to bullies to go and invade places, take their land, and then we come along and say, it's okay, you can have some of that land as long as there's peace. So Doris lives next door. Her house gets invaded, and I think this is an apt analogy. Her house gets attacked by thugs. Thugs go in and they cause all sorts of mayhem in a house. We then, the police come along and they go, hang on, right, we need this to stop. We want peace. We want you thugs to stop thugging around, and we just want there to be peace. Now, Doris, in order for there to be peace, because these thugs are quite strong, we're going to let them have the bottom floor. You're going to have to go and live upstairs. They're going to have your lounge. And Doris is like, but hang on, I was watching TV in my lounge previously. Now I have to go upstairs and watch TV. And they're like, yeah, because we want peace. It's really important there's peace. So there's no kind of understanding here that the police are going to hoik the thugs out of Doris's house and send them on their way and put them in prison or anything like that. Any ramification for them? It's like, we just want peace. And therefore, the only way to have peace, because these guys are quite strong, is that you guys just have to stop fighting. So Doris, you need to shut up. You thugs need to shut up. And you guys can live in her lounge and you can have that. Like, if we did that, all the thugs around the local area are going to be like, well, so what? If we invade people's houses, then if we're strong enough to overcome them, then the police would just let us keep some of their houses. Awesome. All that does is just give free rein to anyone who is aggressive enough to attack someone's house, to attack the house, and then the police come along and go, oh, okay, well, as long as you guys are quiet, just keep it quiet, then you can keep some of that house. Now, from Doris's point of view, as like for someone like me, it's easy to say that's horrific. I absolutely despise the fact that some of that house will be given away, or some of Ukraine will be given away to the Ukrainians. But if from Doris's point of view, she's in the house and she's like, right, I've had my arm broken, I've had my leg broken, I'm not as strong as these thugs, I'm not going to win this. This is just going to go on for as long as possible, but I eventually might die. So do you know what? These guys have come along and said, okay, the thugs can keep the lounge and the downstairs. I've got to go upstairs. If I can take my TV upstairs, I can probably get used to living upstairs. I'm going to heal a bit. I'll rehabilitate upstairs, and I'll get my strength back. But maybe I can try and negotiate getting the thugs to move out at some point later in time. But right now, I'm really tired of this fighting, and I don't have it left in me to continue this fight. And I think like the only way is to allow those thugs to control the bottom of my house. And that's basically where the thinking is for some of these Ukrainians, which is understandable. It's like, after 3 years of war, it's looking like there's not going to be this resounding success that we were hoping for. It looks like the US support for Ukraine could be compromised after January the 20th. It looks like, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so actually, yeah, I can see that we might have to cede some territory in order for peace to come about. So we can understand that, you know, using Doris's analogy, I think gives us a bit of clarity as to exactly what's going on in Ukraine. But from an outsider's point of view, it's deeply, I think, unacceptable that we would be forcing on Ukraine the idea that they should cede territory for peace. I just find that's not acceptable. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully my Doris, poor old Doris, she does have a hard life of it, doesn't she? Hopefully that makes sense and is apt. So anyway, moving on here, there is a Gustav Gressel talks about this very interesting, quite doomy article in the Euromaidan press from Tatragami. Tatragami has done a massive article. We won't go too deep into it. I know Andrew Perpetual is still there, who he is, will have quite a few views on this. This is sort of a lot of stuff he talks about in his lives and whatnot. So Andrew Perpetua, interesting. The average person has no idea how Ukraine wins a war, and it has been shown since day one. Ukraine will never win on the battlefield. They don't need to win a single battle. Russia will leave. That's exactly what I've been arguing, which is that you've got to win economically. Russia need to be failing off the battlefield, and then they will pull back, and then you have your territory back. Which is why I think the biggest threat to Ukraine in this war of the Trump administration is if they lift sanctions. If they take the foot economically off Russia, then my opinion is that, you know, that's kind of game over. You win on the battlefield by winning in the economic and political sphere. And then that brings about wins on the battlefield. And I think also they need to concentrate on distance strikes. So for me, how do you? Yeah, you've heard me say this before. How do you kill lots of Russian soldiers? How do you attrit Russian resources and forces and material? Well, you hit them in ways that doesn't require any of your soldiers to die. So you send missiles and drones, missiles and drones, missiles and drones, and rockets, missiles and drones, and artillery. You do all of that from a distance, and if you can do as much of that and damage Russia as much as possible, both in Russia and in occupied territories, then that also is a way of bringing about a win on the battlefield. But anyway, Tadragami here says, from the point of winning on the battlefield, he says, well, look, in order to win on the battlefield, you still need infantry troops on the ground to control territory. Even the best defensive positions are worthless if there aren't soldiers there to defend them. The problem is, who wants to be a soldier? Like, literally, if you've got all the jobs you can do in the armed forces or Ukrainian armed forces or Ukrainian army, like if I was like given a list of things to do, like being that guy in a dugout in the freezing temperatures, getting trench foot, like, is going to be the person I choose, is the option I'm going to choose the least, right? I'm going to be like, oh, can I be the SUV driver that drives the air defense groups around with the kind of autocannons on the back? I just drive from A to B, tell me where to drive and we'll shoot down some Shahid drones. That's my job. Just, yeah, I'll keep on driving. Yeah, no problem. Well away. I'm never going to be shot by the enemy because I'm near Lviv or something. Okay, so that whole range of what you can do, medic here and there, you know, those infantry on the front line, it sucks to be them. Who would want to volunteer? So the point is that not many people now are going to want to volunteer 3 years into the war. So how do you get people to do that, assuming you still need that job to be done? Mobilization setbacks and infantry shortages, you need to sort out mobilization. So you need to force people to do that. Infantry soldiers often face a brutal task to draw enemy fire and absorb drone attacks, trying to survive from one fight to the next. No nation can win a grinding conventional war of attrition through volunteers alone. Units appear fully staffed on paper but lack real combat capability. And adding 80,000 infantry troops could transform Ukraine's frontline situation. So we've had all of these mobilization arguments before, the for and against for mass mobilization cohorts being, 18 to 25 being the smallest cohort for men. You've got the lowest birth rates and economy and children and blah, blah, blah. You've got those issues, but then you've got a war to win as well. So if Ukraine delays mobilization while waiting for Western equipment that may never arrive, it risks total defeat. He also says other issues are organizational and structural failures. They've got a small but professional army is what they went for before the war. They need a massive army. Temporary leaders don't face the same accountability as permanent division or corps commanders. So on and so forth. So structural problems, false reporting and lack of accountability. Here gives an example: battalion commander afraid to take responsibility passes the choice up to the brigade commander of when an assault needs to retreat, when a unit needs to retreat. Instead of making a quick tactical decision, the command chain freezes up. So the battalion commander passes up, the brigade commander does the same, pushing it to the temporary OTU leadership. The OTU sends it to the SUV, and the decision keeps climbing higher, eventually reaching the commander-in-chief himself, where you need NCO leadership and etc., etc. What should be a quick battlefield decision turns into a bureaucratic nightmare. So that kind of thing needs to end. The West and the perception of betrayal has led to low morale, and that's an issue. So what is the US doing? Are they going to continue supporting? Are they? Aren't they? That leads to dips in morale. Foreign support often decides the fate of nations fighting larger enemies. Despite having an economy 10 times larger than Russia's, Western nations haven't ramped up military production to meet wartime needs. It's another issue. Failed communications, unclear goals being the issue there as well. This fed a dangerous optimism about the upcoming counteroffensive. So you had issues with not really knowing what the clear objectives were, and also actually not having a good. So Zaluzhny, I think, can be criticized for really misreading the counteroffensive, thinking they were going to advance 30 kilometers a day. It's not just about having poor communication and unclear goals, but also unrealistic goals. So those kind of issues, defensive lines not being built, Avdiivka, Defense is not being built on time and well enough and in the right places. Fundamental error as portraying foreign aid as a decisive key to victory while minimizing unresolved problems at home. So yeah, 7 months of impasse in Congress was not good for getting aid to Ukraine, but there were other issues to do with mobilization and defenses, fortifications and whatnot that needed sorting out. To keep morale up, many journalists, analysts and soldiers with large online followings often avoided uncomfortable truths, and this is something I need to deal with. I will naturally be favoring good news for Ukraine rather than bad news, and I need to make sure that I am communicating objectively and neutrally, even though I'm telling you exactly where morally I stand. The facts of what is going on need to be understood. So it's a bit like if you're an alcoholic, you cannot accept that you are. If you don't accept that you're an alcoholic, that you're dependent on alcohol, then you can't do anything to solve that problem. In order to solve problems, you have to admit that you have a problem in the first place. So in order for the Ukrainians to admit to solve the problems they have, they need to admit them, and we need to admit them. We need to communicate them. So he says, Territorial says, you need to reform military leadership. So moving from that kind of old Soviet era kind of system based to one based on merit, not connections and not political loyalties. You need to elevate the conditions of frontline infantry. I don't know how you do that. I mean, that's it depends what you mean by conditions, whether you're talking about pay and rotations and stuff like that. Definitely that's the things you can sort out, but the actual conditions, those war conditions have been the same for a long time. Thousands of soldiers are deserting or refusing to follow orders and go to the front. Ukraine's military court system is basically dead, having been effectively dismantled, and that needs sorting out and made, as he says here, creating an independent oversight body modeled after the US Army's Office of the Inspector General. Soldiers must be assured by the state that they will not be abandoned if they're injured and all that kind of stuff. And then you need to reform the army structure. So much stuff, and transforming the training system. It wasn't fit for practice. Even the NATO training was poor at the beginning. It was ill suited to the demands of the Ukrainian conflict. It is improving now, but yeah, it needs to be far improved. Multiple reports describe soldiers spending weeks in basic training, idle or on non-combat duties. Swift, thorough investigation of these issues is critical. Effective ground-tested training practices should be systematically evaluated and then scaled up. It says, there are good things. When good things happen, in areas where Ukrainian forces have superior training, coordination, planning, and Western-supplied firepower, Russian assaults are decimated. When it works well, it works well. We need to learn from what works well and apply that more generally. Gustav Gressel talks about this article. Go and read it. It's a massive article. I've just really gone over it very quickly. He says, and he's an Austrian military analyst, the structural deficits of the Ukrainian army described above become worse the longer the war lasts. Helping to cure them will require Western military advisors going to Ukraine, not just visiting to show a few very clever PowerPoints. In general, Ukrainians know what needs to be fixed, but fixing is held up or lost in many political bureaucratic infights. You can't weigh into those infights. You can't weigh into those infights if you aren't there. And by adding international cooperation, you can force Ukraine to structure and institutionalize informal processes. Macron started this discussion on advisors over a year ago, but the US and the German position was negative outright. With that, others had no enthusiasm as well. I have no hopes for DC for the US, but maybe Germany will get more flexible after the elections, and Great Britain again leaving the DC tailwater under the Trump administration. Okay, so what all that means is that we need to be considering Western troops in Ukraine to help alleviate some of these issues. Macron was onto that, but was met with negativity from the US and Germany. Let's forget the US. Trump administration seems to be, whatever. Germany could turn around with the new elections and support something like that. There's a lot more talk about that, although it seems to be connected to peacekeeping forces. UK could come on board, so it might happen. Fingers crossed. Don't know. Okay, so some good news things. North Korean forces have been routed in deadly Ukrainian traps near Russia's Kruglenkoye. This is in the Kursk region. Reporting from Ukraine has reported on this. Ukrainians have employed automatic grenade launchers and drones, exploiting the North Koreans' exposed formations in narrow forests. So the Ukrainians making the Russians lose an awful lot. Russia's destroyed 75% of the residential buildings in Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast. But despite Russian attempts to capture the city, Ukrainian defenders are inflicting heavy losses on the invaders, with up to 400 Russian troops killed daily. Again, yep, the Russians, North Koreans losing a lot, but they're still taking that territory. They still are able to overcome the Ukrainians in terms of just mass. Worth noting that in the Kerch Bridge area, half of the barges that were set up there to stop the bridge from being attacked by USVs from unmanned sea vehicles, surface vehicles, or indeed underwater vehicles, half of these, 18 out of 34 of them, have been taken out by storms, and they don't appear to be fixing them back up again. So it could be that the Kerch Bridge is somewhat oh dear, I don't know what's going on there. The Kerch Bridge is somewhat vulnerable again. Now, I'm not going to read through all this again. I think it's a really interesting one. There's a very good Chris Owicki thread on the Azerbaijani airliner that was shot down, and an investigation has been done. Has been leaked, a Russian investigation. It was two Panzer S1, or one particular one, that shot the airliner down with 2 missiles. And there was supposedly electronic warfare jamming, so it got it jammed. It should have known it was an airliner, but there was no communication of what airliners were around, and it came up as a color on the screen that suggested it was fine to shoot down. And they asked permission from Rostov, and Rostov gave them. And anyway, a really fascinating investigation, but it appears that the Russians are going to be scrabbling around for a scare quotes drone that they found on the ground, because they want to change the narrative to say that, yeah, okay, the Panzer did shoot it down, but they were trying to shoot a drone down that was just nearby. But they haven't found this drone yet, so they might plant a drone there to try and change the narrative. Anyway, that's a really interesting thread on that airline being shot down, and the fact that it was the Russians what did it, and the Russian investigation has apparently shown that. Inflation is still bad in Russia, up to 20% now, apparently. Real inflation hovering around that. Depends what for. Videos of soaring prices for groceries are going viral on Russian social media. Some Russians also try complaining to their local authorities about this, but unsurprisingly, to no avail. He goes on to talk about it later. But yeah, inflation is bad. Okay, now I'm going to go. That's the end of what I had to say. I do have to shoot in a second, but I have an awful lot of questions I really should get to, because you guys have very kindly asked them. Can I just say thank you to Paul Gilbert? Thanks for that, mate. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your support. And also Kobe Jack gifting 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, the question, Goose Springsteen is always thoughtful with his questions. When do mixed-use structures become a valid target? E.g., most military theorists would agree bridges, power plants are, but is a block of flats housing both soldiers and civilians a military target? Brilliant question. Moral dilemmas. The answer is, there is no answer. It's subjective. And I've talked about this before. This is the Socrates paradox. When you have something existing on a continuum, where you're moving from, in this case, right and wrong, but it could be from like one species to the next species. We draw an arbitrary line in the sand and say, okay, well, this species evolved into this species. At which point did species A give birth to species B? Well, it didn't. It's just this gradual process that happens over many generations, with minor changes each way. And drawing a line helps us to categorize for the sake of easy categorization and abstract simplicity. But in reality, that line doesn't exist. There's a fuzzy logic that applies to differentiating when you've got a gradual change and you're putting it into 2 binary options. The Socrates paradox talks about this, which is, when you take a grain of sand off a sand dune, when does it become not a sand dune? And the point is that if you keep doing that, at some point it gets to a not sand dune, but no one's going to agree on that. It's not an exact point. And the paradox is, because we can't agree on that, we keep saying, no, it's still a sand dune, still a sand dune. You end up getting to 0 grains of sand, and it's still a sand dune. And you haven't been able to identify a single point that it turns from a sand dune not to sand dune. And that's called the Socrates paradox. It's a paradox, and it illustrates how defining points on a continuum becomes really, really difficult. Or objectively impossible, because actually any delineation, all ideas are mental constructs that we construct, and when we agree on them, we write dictionaries and encyclopedias and so on and so forth, and we just agree on stuff by consensus. So it's really important to understand this. This is a philosophy behind stuff like this. So I always have to say this and use the same examples because it's the same problem, which is, when does a mixed use structure become a valid target? So you're going from valid target to not valid target. And at some point, like, is it when 60% of the people in that apartment block are military, or 70%? Does it need to be 80% and 20% civilian, or does it need to be 100%? And I may say one number, you may say another, and there's no objective reality to this. So we have to agree on by consensus. So what happens is people write books on how to do warfare and legal warfare, and the Geneva Convention kind of makes a rule, but you've got to understand it's fairly arbitrary, and sometimes there's necessary vagueness there. So I think the rule on like power plants, for example, is the quote is from one of the American war declarations, is something like, they are generally seen as bona fide military targets. Well, there's a load of vagueness there. Like, so a military, so a power plant being used predominantly by the military in that particular area close to the front line, let's blow that up. But what about a power plant right behind that's going to be much more used for civilian purposes? Is it okay to hit that in war? Or what if there's a single manufacturing plant there? At what point does that thermal power plant become a genuine military target? Or are all thermal power plants, is everything in the country just generally a military target because you're at war with that country? You know, these are massive moral quagmires that we have to wade through. There's no objective answer. So you will have some people saying, well, that building was a genuine military target, and you also have other people saying that building wasn't a military target, and both of them can be right or wrong depending on, you know, whether you agree with them. These are essentially subjective. What you want is consensus agreement. So you want people to come together and broadly agree that that is a military target, knowing that actually you aren't always going to get agreements. So, for example, the use of mines is something that we talked about previously, or cluster munitions. Some people will say that's terrible. Other people will say, well, because, you know, they can leave aside unexploded munition ordnance for civilians to land on, to walk on and die in times of peace. But then on the other hand, it's like, well, these are the best way to kill the enemy soldiers, which brings about the war sooner. And actually, you know, it's the right thing to use. And there are pros and cons to using something like cluster munitions, where you can present arguments cogently for both sides, and there is no objective like truth to whether they are right or wrong. These things move around and they're slippery, and we just have to argue with them and hope that we agree on them. But doesn't stop them being really, really good questions. Thanks, Goose. And Goose then goes on to say, is there a tension between your morality and geopolitics? Always. I mean, well, politics is morality, just on, I say politics more than geopolitics. So politics is what we should do as a country or society, right? So we should have this tax, and that tax is lifted off the population by doing this, and then we use that tax for doing that. But what you're saying is we should do this, and as soon as you're saying should or obligations, you're talking about morality. In other words, politics is a subset of morality. So is there a tension between politics and morality? No, politics is morality, and geopolitics is morality as well to some degree, which is, should Russia have invaded Ukraine? No. And I then present a bunch of moral arguments as to why they shouldn't. But essentially, all of this is, or at least the most meaningful parts, are moral philosophy. What should we do to support Ukraine? Why should we support Ukraine is a moral obligation. We are morally obliged to support Ukraine because, or we should not support Ukraine because. So it is morality. So geopolitics is largely moral philosophy, which is why sometimes it's useful to have some kind of understanding of how you do moral philosophy. I remember watching I was on the TV show, Big Questions on the BBC once, about free will, because I wrote a book on free will. But I remember watching one of the episodes on torture, whether you should torture in war. And they were all talking about these different examples of torture and whether it was right or wrong, without saying, and I was like, what are you doing talking about torture up here at the real veneer level? You need to come down here and say, well, can you use people as a means to an end? This is utilitarian ethics. You need to explore whether consequentialist ethics, which is, you know, the whole, should I be able to pull a lever to kill one person in order to save five? Should I be able to torture this person, do horrible things to this person in order to get information out of this person that might save 5 people? Now, that's what you need to be talking about, rather than, oh, what about this time when Abu Ghraib, when this happened? No. You need to be doing a moral philosophy. This is what informs whether you make rules in, this is your politics over whether torture is acceptable or not. You do the basics and then work up. You need to work from bottom up. I'm all about bottom up thinking rather than top down thinking. So, yeah, what's the question? Russia gains influence by enabling autocracy. Yes. In Africa, France is in retreat, partly because of higher morals. I don't know why France has retreated. Is it because of higher morals, or is it because it was untenable for them to be there? I don't know. Would they have stayed there extracting from those places if they hadn't been forced out? So, but I don't know. Assume that's correct. Do we need to play dirty? Now, that question is a super important one, I think. So Ukraine is playing by the rules, and they're doing that because if they don't play by the rules, yeah, you can argue they're doing it from a higher moral point of view because they're better people or something like that. But I think it's more pragmatic utility in, like, if they don't play by the rules, they will not get Western support, weapons, humanitarian assistance, and money. So if Ukraine started bombing the crap out of Russian cities and killing civilians, then we'd be, right, we're not helping you anymore. Ukraine need to keep up this position of having a higher moral ground. The problem is it constrains what they're able to do in some contexts. And at some points they'll be like, it would be really useful if we could blow up this thing or do that, which is playing dirty. Or, I've said there's been some really interesting moral discussions over scammers. Ukrainian scammers are scamming Russian people out of their money and telling them to go and, according to the Russians anyway, telling them to go and release fireworks in the shopping malls. Okay, I hate scammers, but is it acceptable for them to do that to Russians, to get that money out of Russians to then spend on drones for Ukrainian units? Put in the lever, trolley experiment, same thing. Does an evil get justified by a greater good that comes about from it? These are moral discussions. So, that's kind of playing dirty, and that's the Ukrainians playing dirty. If they can keep that on a low down, so not everyone hears about that, then that allows them to get some money to help bring about the war sooner, which is your greater good. So playing dirty is something that I would, it gets dodgy, and it had to be case by case basis, but I would justify doing that as long as it doesn't bring about a worse end, which is actually people stop helping Ukraine. So there is going to be some tension there between what they do and what they allow people to know that they're doing, and trying to hold that moral high ground as well. War is dirty, and if one side's allowed to play dirty the whole time, they will extract an advantage. There's an asymmetry there because one side has to adhere to all these rules. We can't do this, we can't do that, we can't do this. And Russia, like, we can do whatever we like. We can go and get people from abroad. We can get migrants, illegal and legal. We can round them up. We can send them into war. We can give them no training, give them an AK-47 and 10 rounds and tell them to run at the Ukrainians. And we get an advantage of overcoming the Ukrainians with loads of people. But we've done that in a pretty horrible way. And the Ukrainians are like, yeah, we're trying to play by the rules, and we're at a disadvantage by playing by the rules. But if we don't play by the rules, we'll be in an even greater disadvantage because the West will not support us anymore. Hope that makes sense. This is all spitballing. Words are tumbling out of my mouth. I'm agreeing with them as they come out. So it sounds cogent to me. Let me know if you think it's cogent. Thanks, Goose. Always great questions. Kevin Force, 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships, total ledge. Always. Johnny Christensen, thanks for your Danish love, my man. Super sticker, ledge. Goose Springsteen, sorry, JP. I've had ATP Geopolitics live stream withdrawal and wrote about 15 questions and thoughts. Stop it, Goose. Just stop it. I need to go. I really do need to go. But thanks, mate. You're really super kind as well. Thank you very much for that, Goose. Honestly, amazing. Mikey, you don't need to, Mikey. Thank you, though. You are an absolute legend, officer and a gentleman. Mikey from Cambridge, who has had his own issues, I think, previously. I think health-wise, a few of you, some of you, David Howes as well, been really kind, having some issues too, though. Thank you. Thanks, Mikey. You're such a stalwart supporter of the channel. Julian Rossiter, thanks for your ATP Geopolitics memberships. You are a legend. allowing people like Tom MPS to become a member. Maybe, I don't know. Thank you, Tom, for becoming a member. Goose Springsteen, I think the problem with the Doris analogy is that in this case, the thugs can destroy the world if challenged. It's hard to inflict total defeat on a nuclear power with energy and food independence. Right. Yeah. So the analogy will have its limits. Here, the thugs have nuclear weapons as well. We have nuclear weapons. Doris doesn't. So there are some really fascinating dynamics going on there. But yeah, I get that there are limits to that. But within, I think the basic principle of the analogy works. Goose, again, you said attacks on infrastructure are an act of war, and I'm inclined to agree. But per Washington Post and New York Times reporting, it's plausible to think Ukraine was responsible for the destruction of Nord Stream 2. If true, how should we feel about it? This is a big one. So I've kind of wrangled with this a little bit. I'm still not sure who's responsible for Nord Stream 2, but imagine if Ukraine was responsible for blowing up that pipeline. That has weaned Russia off, that's weaned Germany off Russian gas, and has actually done, it's actually a really significant thing. If Ukraine did that, it's very clever and is a good thing if you're just going on moral consequentialist ethics. Of course, this isn't the framework that indubitably works. There are many moral frameworks and none of them are perfect, which is why I'm a moral skeptic. I said the other day as a moral nihilist. I'm not. There is morality. We just construct it. I'm a moral skeptic. I'm skeptical that there is any objective moral framework. And what this means is that if you're using moral consequentialism, you can argue that Ukraine blowing up Nord Stream 2 was a good thing, certainly for Ukraine. Because I talked about this in, I've not released it yet, but in my first geopolitics video, that there is a really interesting situation where Russia has lost its leverage on Europe with regard to hydrocarbons. And it can't replace that through going to Asia, and it won't get that back if the war ends, because actually we'll be using substitutes. Russia is in a bad place, and part of that is because Nord Stream 2 is gone, right? As well as these other places, the Druzhba pipeline and the Toyuz pipeline. And it only has a Turk Stream pipeline now coming through sort of Turkey and the Black Sea. And can you be, as a German, really pissed off with the Ukrainians for blowing up your pipeline that supplies gas from Russia to you? Yeah, you're within your rights to be super annoyed at the Ukrainians, but also understand why they did that. And and this is difficult. Like, it depends how broad your moral analysis. I don't want to get too deep into the philosophy here, but there's different ways of doing consequentialism. Like, for example, I can give there are many different types of moral consequentialism, consequentialism, and rules of thumb and all this. I don't want to bore you too much, but like, if I gave a homeless person £5, right, and I say, there you go, is that a good thing to do? Well, that guy goes and buys some. That's nice in itself. Like, my intention is that you go and do something nice with that £5. Okay, that's a nice thing to do. If I measure that in like 10 seconds, that's a nice thing to do. Then let's measure in 10 minutes. Actually, he goes and buys some drugs and starts taking some drugs. Okay, so that's bad. He then becomes, so if I measure that in over 10 minutes, that's bad. If I measure it over like 20 days, he then becomes an addict. I'm like, oh, this is really bad. But then after 2 years, he becomes a rehabilitated, like, former addict who is, or former drug user, who then starts working to stop other homeless people get addicted to drugs. Oh, so if I measure that £5 now and the consequences of that over 10 years, is now gone into really good. And then so the moral evaluation can change depending on at what time point you measure this. If you're just looking at strict outcomes. But then we can look at intentions. It's not the outcomes, it's my intention of what you use this money for. But then it's like, should it be incumbent upon me to learn as much as possible about what happens when I give £5 to homeless people and what it's likely to be spent on? So we can wonder about all the evaluations of morality of how we work out, even within this one value system, which isn't necessarily the value system that works. None of them work perfectly. So consequentialism is super problematic and difficult to work out, and there are different strains of it. So if we're using that, how will we apply it to Ukraine in blowing up Nord Stream 2? and how long do we look at this over, and how far do we see this as spreading from country to country, and blah, 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 blah. So it just becomes really, really difficult. But I think on balance, I would begrudgingly say that if Ukraine did that, it's a good thing, as in the outcome of them doing that is beneficial in hobbling Russia, and therefore is a good thing for the outcome of the war. And I might have to, it's difficult because I'm justifying them blowing up someone else's stuff, but it is for a greater good. Yeah. Ollie Nielsen, thank you for your Danish love. Goodness me. Right. Rangers Rule. Thank you for everything you do, JP, and others. Thank you, Rangers Rule, for supporting the channel. And all of this will be helping us to go out and deliver those trucks to Ukraine, paying for fuel and whatnot to get the trucks out there as we're doing a convoy. And I'll be reporting back from that. So thank you all for your support. Goose Springsteen. Goose, stop it. I don't think troops will be deployed as they become military targets. Yeah, I agree. I think you're looking at the lower probability here. I tend to agree. I don't think there's a scenario that avoids air defense manned by Western troops. I agree with that. Shooting at Russian jets. I don't think they'll shoot at Russian jets, though, because I think they'll be on the west. They'll be shooting at Russian missiles. That risks a hot war. So I wouldn't go that far, but I do understand that in order to have Western training, you'll have to have Western air defense, and then you're sort of having full-on Western military application, or certainly to the west of Ukraine. I actually don't think that's too much of a problem, because they will only be defending against airstrikes. You will not get Russian planes going over the western Ukraine. However, it does become more complex than just sending out a bunch of trainers. Pablo Non-Picasso. Nice name. A good way to, and thanks for your support, a good way to compare it is to look at what the UK did in World War II with special forces and SBS and other arms they used to influence and sometimes kill those they saw a reason to. Ukraine is not carpet bombing cities. Yes. You know, in the Second World War, the UK did some pretty horrific things, like, you know, bombing parts of Germany in horrific ways. You know, you look at this, is the same moral theorizing is the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Terrible. Like, you wouldn't justify that these days. Imagine saying, right, if we drop an atom bomb on Moscow, then the war will stop, and everyone go, yeah, that's a good idea. Wow. I think we undervalue the moral heinousness, at least prima facie, of dropping atom bombs on civilian cities. We kind of forget that it's something that happened in the past, and we're like, yeah, okay, that's happened. We don't really know. If that happened now, we'd just be like, what? I mean, we found it problematic enough that Israel was bombing Gaza to the tune of 30 to 40,000 civilian deaths in the hope of killing lots of Hamas. Okay, but like Nagasaki was like not in the hope of killing lots of Hamas. It was like 100,000 civilians dead. So hugely problematic, but it's consequential. This ethics, which is like, if we kill this many people here, then they'll give up and it'll stop way more people dying in the long run. And it's that pulling the lever on the in the trolley experiment. And it's also worth remembering that those two atom bombs on the back of firebombing Tokyo and some really horrific things of like whole areas of Japanese, and to think the Japanese are now allies of the US is mind-blowing. It's actually testament to the forgiveness that's gone on there and all the reconciliation. Incredible. But yeah, anyway, sorry to have banged on so much about moral philosophy here, but you know, when you're talking politics, you're talking morality. When you're talking war, you're talking morality. And there you go. I hope that was all okay for you guys. I am going to have to shoot now. Thank you so much for your support, and thank you for I'm sure, the wonderful conversations going on in the sidelines. I really appreciate Andrew Perpetua being on the chat as well. I've been unable to see the live chat more recently because I've been answering those questions. Thank you, Andrew. We need to have a chat just separately, me and you, and do a live stream of that and see what your thoughts are on all the sorts of things that I commented about that I might get wrong, so on and so forth. Thank you very much. You guys take care. I really, really appreciate Goose Springsteen and all the others who have been so generous in your support. Goose, some absolutely brilliant questions. I love a bit of moral conversation, and honestly, I think that's like 2 hours worth of conversation in just your questions alone. Easy. JP was going to go about 15 minutes ago. Pablo, you're partly to blame. He must be in line for a pint at the pub. Do you know what, my mate Matt, I haven't seen him for a couple of years now. He only lives in Christchurch in Bournemouth. He's coming up, and on the phone he's like, oh, I don't know if he's just poking me in the side, but I think we're going to talk about whether, support for Ukraine. I don't know whether he's going to be presenting himself as like we shouldn't be supporting war type thing. So it's going to be an interesting, and he's such an amazing guy. So I hope he's just thorning me in the side because he knows what floats my goat. Floats my goat, floats my boat, gets my goat. That's what I mean to say. Anyway, take care, guys, and I'll try and get out the geopolitics video soon. I've got 2 of them. I did record one whole one. It was over an hour long, so I cut the US stuff off, but the US stuff is really important. Please watch that too. Some fascinating stuff about Musk, because now we're starting to see the UK get some people like Bill Ackman, these billionaires in the US, saying that the UK should be sanctioned by the US. And you've got Putin and Xi Jinping sitting back, smoking cigars and loving the fact that the US the West is eating itself. It's eating itself. And do you know who's doing that? Predominantly Elon Musk. And who's he doing it to? Germany, the UK, and the Biden administration, all strong supporters of Ukraine. Is there a connection there? And why are these why are AFD and Reform UK being supported by Elon Musk? And these are the people most likely to support Russia rather than the existing establishment politicians and political parties. So yeah, some really interesting stuff. Please watch that. It kind of leads on from yesterday's discussion that I did in a whole video on Elon Musk attacking the UK political scene, which I think is exceptionally dangerous. You can talk about the intricacies of these grooming gangs and the moral intricacies of that in a complex situation, but at the end of the day, there is a wedge that's been driven between the UK and the US by Elon Musk, and that is not good. And my mate is here. I've just been told by my son through the window there. Take care, guys. Speak soon. To the pits.